Alexandra Blackwood was in the middle of cross-examining a hostile witness when the text arrived. Her phone, set to vibrate only for messages from a select list of contacts, buzzed against her thigh, 3 short pulses she had programmed specifically for family emergencies. Her rhythm faltered only slightly, a microsecond pause that no one in the courtroom would have noticed except perhaps the witness, who had been waiting for any sign of weakness. And you expect the jury to believe that you had no knowledge of these transactions, despite your signature appearing on all 17 documents. She kept her voice level, betraying nothing of the sudden unease spreading through her chest. Later, she would remember this moment, standing in her charcoal Armani suit in a Chicago federal courtroom, the weight of her phone suddenly heavy against her leg, and aware that it marked the division between before and after. The witness stammered through a response that Alexandra didn't hear. She was already calculating how quickly she could request a recess. When she finally stepped into the marble hallway and unlocked her phone, the message was brief and unsigned, but she recognized the number belonging to Harriet Weber, her mother's executive assistant for over 20 years. Eleanor Blackwood passed at 5:17 a.m. Family meeting at Blackwood House. Thursday, 3 p.m. Attendance mandatory. No spouses or significant others. Alexandra felt nothing at first, the concerning absence of emotion, that she immediately analyzed with the same detachment she brought to legal briefs. Her mother was dead. The woman who had shaped her life through presence and absence alike was gone, and Alexandra's first thought was irritation at the disruption to her trial schedule. She returned to the courtroom, requested a 3-day continuance citing a family emergency. By late afternoon she was on a private flight, leaving behind her husband, Theo, who wasn't even sure why she went. He'd been in Eleanor's presence only twice, at their wedding 10 years prior, and at the funeral of Alexandra's father. James Blackwood was charming a table of potential investors when his phone lit up with Harriet's message. The San Juan Resort's oceanfront restaurant provided a backdrop of crashing waves and spectacular sunset, the perfect setting to secure the 8-figure investment he needed to keep his newest fund afloat after 3 quarters of disappointing returns. If you'll excuse me for just a moment, gentlemen, when my assistant flags something urgent, it usually means someone is about to make a great deal of money. He flashed his trademark smile, the one profiled in Bloomberg Businessweek's 40 Under 40 issue 3 years ago, and stepped away from the table. The smile vanished when he read the message, not from grief, but from calculation. His mother's death meant the trust would finally be distributed, and his financial problems solved. But the mandatory meeting was troubling. Eleanor Blackwood had never done anything simply, especially when it came to money. He returned to the table, apologies flowing effortlessly. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate family news. My mother has passed away, and I'll need to fly back to Boston tomorrow. The sympathy from the investors was immediate, as was their understanding when he suggested they continue discussions after the funeral. James knew the death of a wealthy matriarch made him seem like an even more attractive investment opportunity. He ordered another round of drinks on his nearly maxed-out card and turned the conversation to their families, building the personal connections that would make it harder for them to say no when he returned. Olivia Blackwood was sleeping when the message arrived, her studio apartment in Brooklyn still dark despite the late morning hour. She had been working until dawn on a commission piece that needed to be finished by the end of the week, a necessity if she wanted to make rent since her girlfriend moved out. Upset over her long hours in front of her canvases, and inability to devote any time to her. It was past noon when she finally saw Harriet's text. She sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by paint-splattered sheets and canvases stacked against every wall, and read it 3 times before the meaning penetrated. Unlike her siblings, Olivia felt the loss immediately, not of the mother she'd had, but of the mother she'd never stop hoping Eleanor might become. The complicated grief crashed through her, followed by a flash of anger at the summons. Even in death, Eleanor was issuing commands rather than requests. Olivia looked around her cluttered apartment, at the half-finished commission that would barely cover another month in this overpriced showbox, and calculated what a flight to Boston would do to her precarious finances. She checked train schedules, then typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on, "I'll be there." Thomas Blackwood didn't need a text to learn of his mother's death. He had been there, sitting beside her hospital bed, when the machines registered the final heartbeat, watching the line go flat while nurses rushed in. He had signed the necessary papers, made the initial calls, and driven directly to Blackwood House to begin preparations. As the only child who had remained in Boston, working directly under Eleanor at Blackwood Enterprises, Thomas had assumed the logistical burdens that came with death. He had always been the dependable one, The son who had built his life around making himself indispensable to his mother. Now he sat in Eleanor's study, surrounded by the artifacts of her remarkable life, the awards, the photographs with presidents and prime ministers, the tasteful evidence of wealth accumulated through decades of ruthless business acumen. He felt hollow, as though something vital had been scooped out of him. Without Eleanor to orbit, he wasn't entirely sure who he was. Harriet entered without knocking, her efficiency undiminished by grief. "I've notified your siblings," she said, placing a cup of black coffee on the desk. "The lawyers will be here Thursday as requested." Thomas nodded, noticing the slight emphasis on, as requested, and wondered, not for the first time, how much Harriet knew about his mother's plans. Eleanor had withdrawn into near seclusion over the past 6 months, allowing only Harriet and occasionally Thomas into her confidence. Even Thomas had been excluded from certain meetings. "Did she say anything at the end?" Harriet asked, her usual composure slipping just slightly. "No," Thomas lied. His mother's final words had been for him alone, and they had been troubling. "Watch them carefully, Thomas. Remember what I taught you about wolves." By Thursday afternoon, Blackwood House stood ready, its imposing federal architecture and immaculate grounds projecting the same austere wealth that had characterized Eleanor herself. The mansion, set back from Boston's Beacon Hill behind wrought iron gates, had been the family seat for 3 generations, not old money by Boston standards, but old enough to have developed the patina of respectability that Eleanor had coveted. Alexandra arrived first, having taken a car directly from the airport. Her black morning suit might have been selected specifically for the occasion, though in reality, it differed little from her daily courtroom attire. She moved through the house with the cautious precision of someone navigating a space filled with painful memories, noting what had changed and what remained exactly as she remembered. Olivia arrived next, looking travel-worn from the long train ride, and out of place in her paint-stained jeans and oversized sweater, her dark hair piled haphazardly on top of her head. She carried a small, battered backpack that contained everything she had brought for the trip. She hesitated at the threshold before stepping inside, as though crossing an invisible boundary. James was predictably last, his entrance time to make an impression. His designer suit and artificially tousled hair suggested he had come directly from a photo shoot rather than a cross-continental flight. He greeted each sibling with practiced warmth that reached his eyes only when he looked at Olivia, the one family member for whom he maintained genuine affection. Thomas waited in the library, where the family lawyer, Franklin Moss, was arranging documents on the mahogany table that had hosted Blackwood business discussions for decades. Harriet stood by the doors, observing the siblings' reunion with inscrutable professionalism. "I suggest we begin," Franklin said once they were all seated. Mrs. Blackwood left very specific instructions about how this meeting should proceed. The siblings exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement that their mother's control would extend beyond the grave. Franklin opened a sealed envelope and removed a USB drive, which he inserted into a laptop connected to the room's hidden projection system. Eleanor Blackwood's face appeared on the wall, not the gaunt, diminished woman from the hospital bed Thomas was familiar with, but Eleanor from 6 months earlier, formidable and commanding even in her 70s. "My children," the recording began, Eleanor's voice filling the room. "If you're watching this, then I have died, and you are gathered to learn what becomes of the Blackwood fortune." She paused, her gaze seeming to find each of them through the screen. "But inheritance, like everything else of value, must be earned." Eleanor's recorded image stared out from the projection, her steel-gray eyes seeming to evaluate each of her children individually. The silence stretched uncomfortably before she continued. "The Blackwood fortune, our companies, properties, investments, and liquid assets, currently stands at approximately $80 million. James leaned forward slightly, his practiced nonchalance slipping. Alexandra's posture remained rigid, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her leather portfolio. Olivia's eyes fixed on a point just above the projection, refusing to meet even the recorded gaze of her mother. Thomas alone showed no reaction, having already been through this moment in his mind countless times. "This sum will be divided equally among the 4 of you," Eleanor continued. $20 million each. Another calculated pause. Upon completion of 7 tasks, Alexandra's composure broke first. "For God's sake," she muttered, closing her eyes briefly. "I anticipated your reaction, Alexandra," Eleanor said, as though she had heard the interruption. "Your impatience has always been your weakness." Alexandra's eyes snapped open, her face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "The 7 tasks must be completed by all 4 of you together," Eleanor continued. They are non-negotiable. Failure by any one of you means failure for all. The entire estate will then be distributed according to my alternate will, primarily to charitable organizations with modest stipends for each of you." James let out a harsh laugh. "Even dead, she can't resist pulling the strings," he said, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "This is absurd. It's cruel," Olivia added quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the house. But not surprising. Thomas remained silent, watching his siblings' reactions rather than the projection. Eleanor's recorded image seemed to be enjoying their discomfort. Each task corresponds to one of the values that built the Blackwood name: service, heritage, business acumen, sacrifice, reconciliation, honesty, and legacy. The projection changed to show a calendar with dates marked in red. "You will have exactly 7 months to complete all tasks. The executor will provide details of each task only after the previous one has been completed. Video documentation is required throughout." "Video?" Alexandra interrupted again, turning to Franklin. "She can't be serious." The lawyer merely nodded, his expression neutral. "And who is this executor?" James demanded. "You, Franklin?" Franklin cleared his throat. "No, Mr. Blackwood." Mrs. Blackwood appointed Ms. Weber. All eyes turned to Harriet Weber, who stood by the door with perfect posture, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression revealed nothing, but something flickered in her eyes as she met their collective gaze, something that might have been satisfaction. "Harriet." Thomas' surprise was genuine. "Mother never mentioned this to me." "There were many things your mother didn't share with you, Mr. Thomas," Harriet replied, her slight German accent more pronounced than usual. "With any of you?" Olivia laughed suddenly, a sound with no humor in it. "Of course. Who better to torture us than the woman who scheduled our entire childhoods down to 15-minute increments?" Harriet didn't react to the barb. After 23 years as Eleanor Blackwood's executive assistant, she had developed an immunity to the family's emotional outbursts. On screen, Eleanor continued. "The first task begins tomorrow. Consider this your opportunity to prove yourselves worthy of the Blackwood name and fortune." The projection winked out, leaving the siblings staring at a blank wall. Franklin began distributing documents. "These are the basic terms of the conditional bequest. You'll need to sign indicating your intention to participate, or formally decline your share." "This is outrageous," Alexandra said, skimming the document with the rapid efficiency of someone who reviewed contracts for a living. "These terms are incredibly vague. No specifics about the tasks, no recourse if the executor is unreasonable, no appeals process." "That was Mrs. Blackwood's intention," Franklin replied evenly. "Complete trust in the executor or nothing at all." James leaned back in his chair, calculation visible in his eyes. "And if we challenge the will?" Eleanor wasn't well toward the end. "A good lawyer could make a case for diminished capacity." He glanced at Alexandra meaningfully. "Your mother anticipated that strategy," Franklin said. "The documentation of her mental fitness is extremely thorough. 3 independent psychological evaluations, videotaped interviews, notarized statements. Challenging the will would be costly, lengthy, and unlikely to succeed." Alexandra nodded grudgingly, recognizing the thoroughness of the preparation. "And what happens if we just walk away?" Olivia asked, her voice quiet but steady. "If we refuse to play her game, as I mentioned, there is an alternate will that distributes the bulk of the estate to various charitable organizations, with a stipend of $100,000 to each of you," Franklin explained. "100,000?" James repeated incredulously. "That's 0.5% of what we're entitled to." "It's enough for me," Olivia said, surprising everyone. "I didn't expect anything from her anyway." Thomas finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already accepted what was coming. "You can't mean that, Liv. $20 million would change your life. You could paint without worrying about commissions or rent. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" Olivia met her younger brother's gaze. "Not if it means 7 more months of dancing to her tune. I've spent my entire adult life trying to get out from under her control." "We could split Olivia's share," James suggested smoothly. "The 3 of us complete the tasks, and we each give Liv $5 million afterward. Everyone gets what they want." "That won't work," Harriet interrupted. Mrs. Blackwood specified that all 4 siblings must participate in each task. "If Ms. Olivia walks away, you all receive only the stipend." Alexandra's frustration finally boiled over. "This is emotional blackmail. She's forcing us to coerce each other into compliance." "It's worse than that," Thomas said quietly. "She's making us responsible for each other's success or failure. Imagine the resentment if one of us costs everyone the inheritance." A heavy silence fell over the room as they considered the implications. Harriet stepped forward, her presence commanding attention despite her modest height. "Mrs. Blackwood left instructions that you have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to decide. The consent forms must be signed by all 4 of you by then, or the alternate will take effect immediately. She checked her watch. That gives you approximately 17 hours to discuss amongst yourselves. Mr. Moss and I will return in the morning for your decision. Franklin gathered his briefcase. I suggest you take this time to carefully consider your options. Mrs. Blackwood has arranged for dinner to be delivered at 7. Your usual rooms have been prepared if you wish to stay the night. After the lawyer and Harriet departed, the siblings remained around the table, tension thick in the air. She's still controlling us, Alexandra said finally. Even from the grave. Was there ever any doubt she would? James replied, loosening his tie with a sharp tug. Death was just another business strategy for Eleanor Blackwood. Olivia stood abruptly. I need some air. This house is suffocating. Thomas watched her go, then turned to his older siblings. We have to do this together. You know that, right? None of us can afford to walk away from this kind of money. Speak for yourself, Alexandra retorted, though they all knew her law career, while successful, hadn't made her independently wealthy. James snorted. Don't pretend you don't need it to, Alex. That corner office in Chicago doesn't pay for itself. At least I have an office, Alexandra shot back. When was the last time your fund actually turned a profit? Thomas raised his hands placatingly. This is exactly what she wants, us at each other's throats from day one. He hesitated. Look, I know Mother better than any of you. She wouldn't have set this up if she didn't think we could succeed, or if she didn't think it would be exquisitely painful to watch us try, James countered, but there was less bite in his voice. Alexandra gathered the documents into a neat stack. We need to discuss this rationally. $20 million each is worth 7 months of inconvenience, no matter what these tasks entail. You say that now, Olivia said from the doorway, having returned silently, but you don't know what she has planned. The 4 siblings looked at each other, bound by blood, divided by history, and now yoked together by their mother's final manipulation. We have until morning to decide, Thomas said finally, but we all know what choice we're going to make. No one contradicted him. Harriet Weber had served Eleanor Blackwood for 23 years, and in that time, she had perfected the art of invisibility. She knew how to stand in a room so that people forgot she was there, how to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how to absorb information while revealing nothing. These skills had made her invaluable to Eleanor and would now serve her well as executor. As she drove away from Blackwood House, she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The meeting had gone exactly as Eleanor had predicted. Alexandra's immediate search for legal loopholes, James' calculation of angles, Olivia's instinctive resistance, Thomas' resigned acceptance, all of it unfolding like a play Eleanor had written years ago. Harriet turned her modest sedan toward her apartment in Cambridge, a comfortable but unassuming space that reflected nothing of her decades of proximity to wealth. Eleanor had offered her grander accommodations many times, but Harriet had always declined. I prefer to keep my feet on the ground, Mrs. Blackwood, she had explained, and Eleanor had respected that, one pragmatist recognizing another. The apartment was spotless, organized with German precision, a trait her grandmother had instilled in her long before she'd left Munich at 22. Harriet hung her coat, prepared a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at her small dining table, where a leather-bound notebook waited. She opened it and began writing, her precise handwriting documenting the siblings' reactions in detail. Day 0, initial meeting. Alexandra sought control through legal scrutiny. James immediately considered manipulation strategies. Olivia demonstrated expected resistance but will ultimately participate. Thomas attempts mediation, as predicted. This was not the first entry. The notebook contained observations dating back 6 months, when Eleanor had first shared her plan. Why me? Harriet had asked, when Eleanor explained her role as executor. Eleanor had fixed her with that penetrating gaze. Because you understand power, Harriet. You've watched me wield it for 2 decades. And because they underestimate you, they always have. Harriet sipped her tea, reflecting on the weight of the responsibility. Eleanor had trusted her with more than just the execution of tasks. She had entrusted her with the reformation of the Blackwood family itself. Her phone chimed with a message from Thomas. Harriet, we need to discuss this executor arrangement privately. Breakfast tomorrow, 7 a.m., before you return to the house. She had anticipated this. Thomas, feeling betrayed by being kept in the dark, would attempt to establish a separate channel of communication. Eleanor had warned her about this too. My son will try to charm you, Harriet. He believes he inherited my ability to read people, but what he actually inherited was his father's need to be needed. Harriet replied with professional courtesy, 7 a.m. is acceptable. The cafe on Commonwealth Avenue. She returned to her notebook, flipping back to reread Eleanor's instructions for the first task. The service task was designed to be the most straightforward, a week working at a homeless shelter, where the Blackwood Foundation had once promised substantial funding before mysteriously redirecting it elsewhere. Eleanor had chosen it as an opening move, a relatively simple challenge that would lull them into a false sense of security. What the siblings didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that each task had been meticulously designed to expose specific, buried truths. Eleanor had spun a web of revelations that would unfold with devastating precision. Harriet closed the notebook and moved to her study, where a bank of monitors displayed camera feeds from Blackwood House. Eleanor had installed the surveillance system during her last renovation, ostensibly for security, but had granted Harriet exclusive access to the feeds. Now they showed the siblings scattered throughout the mansion, each processing the day's revelations in characteristic fashion. Alexandra paced in the library, phone pressed to her ear, likely consulting with colleagues about the legality of the will's conditions. James lounged in the drawing room with a generous pour of their father's long-forgotten whiskey, making calculations on the back of the consent form. Olivia had escaped to the garden, sketching furiously in the small pad she always carried. Thomas sat in Eleanor's study, staring at the portrait of his mother that dominated the wall. Watching them, Harriet felt a complex mixture of emotions. She had witnessed their childhood wounds, had sometimes been the instrument that inflicted them, always following Eleanor's precise instructions. She had seen the damage Eleanor's parenting had caused, even as she admired the woman's strategic brilliance. For 23 years, she had been the perfect HUSHLTERIN, the keeper of the house, the bearer of order, the executor of another's will. Her grandmother would have approved of her efficiency, if not her complicity. Now she had been elevated to a position of extraordinary power over the children she had helped raise. Eleanor had calculated this too, the psychological impact of having their mother's assistant suddenly controlling their futures. Her phone chimed again. This time it was a text from Franklin Moss. Mrs. Weber, are we certain this is the wisest course? The family dynamics are volatile. I worry about unintended consequences. Harriet considered her response carefully. Franklin had been Eleanor's attorney for 30 years, but his loyalty had always been to the Blackwood family, as an institution rather than to Eleanor herself. He had expressed reservations about the conditional bequest from the beginning. Mr. Moss, Mrs. Blackwood considered all possible outcomes. We proceed as planned. She returned her attention to the monitors. The siblings were now gathered in the kitchen, a rare moment of unity, as they prepared a late-night snack, a childhood habit that had survived into adulthood. They spoke in low voices, their body language suggesting the formation of tentative alliances. Harriet increased the volume. Can't believe she put Harriet in charge, Alexandra was saying as she methodically sliced cheese. The woman's been spying on us, our entire lives. She wasn't spying, Thomas countered, arranging crackers on a plate with unnecessary precision. She was doing her job. Her job was making sure Mother knew everything about us, while we knew nothing about her, James said, pouring wine into 4 glasses. Did any of you know she was German? 23 years, and I thought she was from Connecticut or something. Weber is her married name, Olivia said quietly. Her ex-husband was American, I think. She's from Munich originally. The others looked at her in surprise. Olivia shrugged. She helped me with a school project on Germany once, when I was 12. Mother was in Tokyo, and you were all away at school. She accepted a glass from James. Harriet knows more about this family than anyone alive, which is exactly why Mother chose her, Thomas said. She's the perfect executor, loyal, meticulous, and knows where all the bodies are buried. Charming metaphor, little brother, Alexandra remarked dryly. You know what I mean, Thomas replied. If we're going to get through these tasks, we need to understand what Mother was thinking, and Harriet is our best source of insight. James leaned against the counter. So we charm Harriet. Shouldn't be too difficult? Olivia rolled her eyes. That's your answer to everything, Jamie. Not everyone is susceptible to that smile. Harriet won't be manipulated, Thomas said with certainty. Mother would have made sure of that. Harriet smiled faintly at the assessment. Thomas had always been the most perceptive of the siblings, though his insight was frequently clouded by his need for approval. She switched off the monitors and returned to the dining table to finalize preparations for the first task. The homeless shelter had been notified to expect for volunteers, registered under false names, as Eleanor had arranged, and Harriet had prepared the documentation packages that would reveal James' diversion of the foundation funds once the week was complete. Eleanor's voice seemed to echo in her apartment. Make them face what they've become, Harriet. Make them see each other clearly for the first time. Harriet had never questioned why Eleanor had chosen this particular form of inheritance trial. She understood intuitively that Eleanor was attempting, in her complicated way, to repair what she had broken, to force her children to confront the patterns of behavior that had isolated them from each other and from their own humanity. What Eleanor had never explained, and what Harriet had never asked, was whether these revelations were meant as punishment or redemption. Tomorrow morning she would meet with Thomas, who would undoubtedly attempt to establish himself as her ally. She would appear receptive while maintaining the professional distance Eleanor had instructed. Then she would return to Blackwood House to collect the signed consent forms and deliver the details of the first task. The 7-month countdown would begin, and with it, the unraveling of the Blackwood family's carefully constructed facades. As she prepared for bed, Harriet thought about the meaning of her name, Home Ruler, and how Eleanor had laughed when she first learned it. How terribly appropriate, Eleanor had said. You've ruled my home better than I ever could. Now she would rule over the Blackwood children's journey through their mother's final lesson. The Home Ruler would become the rule maker, the judge, and ultimately, if Eleanor's plan succeeded, the catalyst for transformation. Harriet Weber settled into bed, surrounded by the quiet order of her modest apartment, and prepared herself for the storm that was coming. The café on Commonwealth Avenue was nearly empty at 6:55 a.m. Harriet Weber arrived precisely 5 minutes early, as was her custom, and selected a corner table with a clear view of both the entrance and the street. She ordered a black coffee and waited, her posture perfect even in the uncomfortable wooden chair. Thomas Blackwood arrived at 7:02 a.m., late enough to establish that his time was valuable, but not so late as to be disrespectful. He spotted her immediately, and approached with the carefully calibrated smile he reserved for business negotiations. Harriet, he greeted her, removing his cashmere coat. Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Thomas, she replied formally, a subtle reminder of their altered relationship. The switch from Thomas to Mr. Thomas represented more than professional distance. It was the first indication that the power dynamic had shifted. Thomas' smile faltered slightly as he registered the change. He ordered coffee and a pastry from the hovering waitress before turning back to Harriet. I'll be direct, he said, leaning forward slightly. Mother never mentioned you would be serving as executor. I thought we had no secrets between us, especially in these last months. Harriet regarded him steadily. Your mother had many compartments in her life, Mr. Thomas. Some were known to you, others were not. This arrangement was made some time ago. When, exactly? His tone remained conversational, but Harriet noted the tension in his jaw, a tell he had inherited from Eleanor. 6 months ago, she replied. Around the time of her diagnosis. Thomas nodded slowly. I see. And these tasks? Do you know the details of all of them? I do. Are they reasonable? Achievable? His eyes searched her face for reassurance. They are challenging but possible, Harriet said carefully. Your mother did not design them to be impossible, merely illuminating. Thomas absorbed this, then abruptly changed course. Why wasn't there a funeral, Harriet? Why couldn't I arrange a service, or a memorial? There wasn't even an obituary. We went straight from her death to the reading of the will. That wasn't right. The question caught Harriet slightly off guard, though she didn't show it. Eleanor had anticipated most questions, but this one carried an emotional weight that required careful handling. Your mother left explicit instructions. She wished for no funeral service or public memorial. She felt such events were often performative rather than genuine. Harriet paused, then added, she preferred to be remembered through action rather than ceremony. Thomas' face darkened. That wasn't her decision to make. Funerals aren't for the dead, they're for the living. We deserve the chance to say goodbye properly. Perhaps the tasks themselves are her version of that goodbye, Harriet suggested. A more extended farewell, on her terms. Her terms, Thomas repeated bitterly. It's always been on her terms. The waitress returned with his order, and Thomas fell silent until she departed. There's more to it, he said suddenly. Mother would have wanted to be buried beside father in the family plot. She would have wanted the business associates and politicians she cultivated to see the Blackwood name displayed prominently in the obituaries. A private ceremony, perhaps, but not nothing. Harriet sipped her coffee, buying a moment to construct her response. Eleanor had prepared her for many contingencies, but Thomas' emotional reaction to the lack of funeral rites required careful navigation. Your mother had complicated feelings about death and remembrance, she said finally. In her final months, she expressed a desire to focus on legacy rather than memorialization. Thomas studied her with the same intense scrutiny Eleanor had often employed. You're not telling me everything. Harriet met his gaze without flinching. I am telling you what you need to know for now. His expression hardened. This isn't right, Harriet. 23 years you've been with our family. You've seen everything, the good and the bad. You know I was there for her, at the end when the others weren't. I deserve more than prepared statements. What you deserve and what your mother stipulated are not always aligned, Harriet replied, her tone softening slightly. I understand this is difficult, Mr. Thomas, but I must follow her instructions precisely. Thomas leaned back, reassessing. Were you always this loyal to her, or is this a recent development? My loyalty to Mrs. Blackwood has been consistent throughout my employment, Harriet said. That has not changed with her passing, even when she was wrong, even when she was cruel. Harriet paused, considering her answer carefully. My role was never to judge her actions, merely to execute them with precision. And now you're executing her final action, with the same precision, Thomas said, understanding dawning. These tasks, they're not just about the money, are they? This is something else entirely. Harriet neither confirmed, nor denied this insight. Instead, she checked her watch. We should return to the house. Your siblings will be expecting us at 9. Thomas made no move to leave. The first task begins today, Mr. Thomas. I suggest you prepare yourself, and help your siblings do the same. Thomas remained seated, studying her. You've changed, Harriet. There's something different about you now. Perhaps I am simply fulfilling my purpose, she replied, as your mother always intended. She left money for her coffee, and walked out, feeling Thomas' gaze on her back. The carefully constructed explanation about Eleanor's funeral wishes had been necessary but uncomfortable. Eleanor had been explicit: no funeral, no memorial, no graves, nothing that would provide closure before the tasks were complete. By the time Harriet arrived at Blackwood House, all 4 siblings were gathered in the library, the consent forms arranged neatly on the table. Their postures and expressions told the story of a restless night, spent weighing options and forming alliances. Ms. Weber, Alexandra greeted her, crisp and formal. We've made our decision. Harriet nodded, unsurprised. And Mr. Moss? I'm here, Franklin said, entering behind her with his briefcase. Though I maintain my reservations about this approach. Noted, Harriet replied, her tone making it clear his reservations were irrelevant. James gestured to the signed forms. We're in, all of us. Against our better judgment, perhaps, but we're in. Not that we had much choice, Olivia added, her arms crossed defensively. Thomas said nothing, still processing their conversation at the café. He watched Harriet with new wariness. Harriet collected the forms, checking each signature methodically before handing them to Franklin for verification. Once he nodded his confirmation, she placed a slim folder on the table. The first task begins today, she announced. For 1 week, you will work at the Horizon House homeless shelter in Dorchester. You will use the aliases provided in this folder. You will not reveal your true identities. You will perform whatever duties are assigned to you by the shelter manager. Video documentation will be collected through the shelter's existing security system. Alexandra frowned. Aliases. Why can't we use our own names? Because the point of the task would be compromised, Harriet explained. This is the service task. You are to experience service without the influence of the Blackwood name, or the expectations it creates. And what exactly constitutes completion of this task? James asked, already calculating the minimum effort required. Each of you must complete a full 40-hour week of service, Harriet replied. Transportation has been arranged. You leave in 1 hour. Pack simply. You'll be staying in staff quarters. Staff quarters? Alexandra repeated incredulously. At a homeless shelter. Yes, Harriet confirmed. You will live as the staff lives for the duration of the task. Olivia actually smiled for the first time since arriving. Mother really did think of everything, didn't she? Indeed, Harriet agreed. Mrs. Blackwood was most thorough in her planning. Thomas finally spoke, his voice carrying a new edge. And after we complete this task, what revelation awaits us? Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Mother's choreographed revelations. The other siblings looked at him in surprise. Harriet met his gaze evenly. Each task will reveal what it is designed to reveal, Mr. Thomas. I suggest you focus on completion rather than anticipation. She left them with the folder and clear instructions to be ready at 10. As she walked to her car, she could feel the weight of what was coming. The service task was merely the opening move in Eleanor's elaborate game, the simplest challenge with the most straightforward revelation. James' diversion of the shelter funding would be exposed after their week of service, forcing them to confront the human cost of financial manipulation. It would set the pattern for all that followed. Perform the task, receive the revelation, face the consequences. Harriet started her car and checked the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of Thomas watching her from an upstairs window. He was right to be suspicious, right to sense that something fundamental had changed. But even Thomas, with all his insight, couldn't anticipate what Eleanor had set in motion. The drive to Horizon House took place in uncomfortable silence. The siblings had been loaded into a modest van driven by a taciturn man, who identified himself only as the transportation arranged by Ms. Weber. Alexandra had attempted to work on her phone until Harriet, who had appeared just as they were leaving, confiscated all electronic devices. The task requires your full attention, she had explained, unmoved by their protests. Mrs. Blackwood was explicit about this condition. Now they sat in the van with nothing but their thoughts, and each other's company, a situation they had avoided for years. Horizon House stood in stark contrast to the affluent neighborhoods they had just left. The 5-story brick building had once been a textile factory, before being converted into a shelter and community center. A faded sign announced its mission, providing dignity, building community. The shelter director, a broad-shouldered woman named Rita Carpenter, met them at the entrance. If she found anything unusual about for new volunteers, waving simultaneously, she didn't show it. Ms. Weber explained that you're part of a community service program, she said, eyeing them assessingly. We can use the help, especially in the kitchen and at intake. Fair warning, we're short-staffed and overcrowded. You'll be working hard. She led them through a quick tour of the facility, dormitory-style sleeping areas that housed up to 60 people per night, a dining hall that served 3 meals daily, shower facilities, a clothing distribution center, a medical clinic staffed by volunteer nurses, and a small library that doubled as a job search center. You'll be staying in the staff quarters on the 5th floor, Rita explained, leading them up a narrow staircase. 2 rooms, 2 people per room. Bathrooms are shared with other staff. Meals are taken with residents unless you're on serving duty. The rooms were spartanly furnished with twin beds, metal dressers, and desks that had seen better decades. The walls were institutional beige, the windows small and covered with security screens. Alexandra surveyed the accommodations with thinly veiled horror. This is quite basic. It's a homeless shelter, not the Four Seasons, Rita replied evenly. Staff quarters are a luxury most shelters don't have. Olivia placed her backpack on one of the beds. It's fine. Thank you for accommodating us. Rita handed them each a schedule. You start in 1 hour. Work clothes are in the dressers. I suggest you change and get oriented quickly. Once she left, the siblings stared at each other in the cramped space. This is insane, James said finally. I have a board meeting on Thursday that I can't miss. Mother knew our schedules, Thomas replied, examining the gray uniform he'd been assigned. She chose this week specifically because we all had commitments. Alexandra was already checking her assigned duties. I'm on kitchen duty from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. That's not ideal. Intake interviews, Olivia read from her schedule. That doesn't sound too bad. Bathroom and shower cleaning, James announced, looking physically ill. She's punishing me specifically. Thomas glanced at his own schedule. Overnight supervisor, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., he sighed. Clearly designed to prevent us from strategizing together. They changed into their uniforms in silence, each contemplating the week ahead. The gray pants and shirts were ill-fitting, the fabric rough against skin accustomed to finer materials. We should establish some ground rules, Alexandra said as they prepared to report for duty. We're here to complete the task, not to have meaningful experiences or whatever Mother imagined. Minimum necessary effort, no complications. Agreed, James said quickly. Get in, get out, get the revelation over with. Olivia frowned. That's assuming we can control what happens here. Mother chose this place specifically. Remember, there's something about it that matters to her agenda. Thomas had been unusually quiet since their arrival. Now he turned to his siblings with a serious expression. We need to be careful about what we say to each other here. The security cameras Harriet mentioned, I'm certain they have audio as well as video. She'll be watching and listening to everything. This sobered them all. 7 days, Alexandra said finally. We can survive anything for 7 days. They reported to their assigned stations, separating into the roles that Eleanor had carefully selected for each of them. What they couldn't know, was that Horizon House had been a Blackwood Foundation flagship project 5 years earlier, promised substantial ongoing funding, that had mysteriously been redirected. The shelter had been forced to cut services and staff dramatically as a result, creating the overcrowded conditions they now witnessed. The revelation awaiting them at the end of the week was contained in a sealed folder in Harriet's apartment, documents showing that James, as a Foundation board member, had diverted the shelter funding to an investment opportunity that later collapsed, costing the Foundation millions while generating substantial personal fees for himself. More damning still were the emails showing he had justified the diversion by claiming the shelter was operationally inefficient, despite never having visited it. But that revelation was 7 days away. For now, they faced their first hours of service, each encountering a world they had studiously avoided their entire privileged lives. Alexandra, accustomed to commanding rooms full of attorneys and paralegals, found herself being instructed in basic food safety by a patient kitchen manager. James, whose manicured hands had never touched a toilet brush, stared in dismay at the cleaning supplies he'd been issued. Olivia, who had imagined intake interviews would align with her artistic sensibilities, was confronted by stories of domestic violence, addiction, and systemic failure that left her shaken. And Thomas, preparing for his overnight shift, realized he would be responsible for the safety and needs of 60 strangers while they slept. By the end of the first day, they reconvened briefly in the staff break room, exhausted and subdued. "This is only day 1, James said, his voice hollow. "How are we supposed to last a week?" None of them had an answer. In her apartment across the city, Harriet Weber watched the security feeds from Horizon House on her computer. Eleanor had arranged for separate cameras focused exclusively on her children, capturing their expressions as they encountered the real-world consequences of wealth and its absence. She made notes in her leather-bound book, documenting their reactions with clinical precision. Day 1 had already begun the process Eleanor had envisioned, the slow dismantling of their carefully constructed worldviews. By day 7, when the revelation about James' role in the shelter's funding crisis emerged, the groundwork would be laid for the more difficult tasks to come. Harriet closed her notebook and thought about Thomas' suspicious questions that morning. He sensed that something fundamental about the situation wasn't right, but even he couldn't imagine the full scope of what Eleanor had set in motion. The home ruler surveyed her domain, the monitors showing the Blackwood children beginning their journey of discovery, the notebooks containing Eleanor's meticulous plans, the folders holding revelations that would shatter and potentially rebuild a family. Day 1 complete, she murmured to herself, and turned off the lights. By the third day at Horizon House, exhaustion had settled into the Blackwood siblings' bones like a familiar companion. The physical demands of their assigned duties, tasks they had always paid others to perform, left them with aching muscles and calloused hands. But it was the emotional toll that caught them unprepared. Alexandra, who prided herself on efficiency, found the endless cycle of meal preparation maddening. No matter how many breakfasts she served, more hungry people waited. The kitchen manager, Louisa, noticed her frustration. "First time doing service work?" she asked, expertly cracking eggs with one hand. "Is it that obvious?" Alexandra replied, trying to hide her irritation. "Everyone has that same look at first, like they're trying to solve a problem that can't be solved," Louisa said. "This isn't about efficiency, it's about showing up every day, knowing the need never ends." This concept, service without resolution, was foreign to Alexandra, whose legal career revolved around case closures and billable hours. James struggled most visibly. Bathroom duty had humbled him in ways he couldn't articulate, forcing him to confront human suffering in its most intimate forms. He found himself avoiding his siblings during breaks, unwilling to face their judgment or acknowledgement of his discomfort. On day 4, while scrubbing shower stalls, he was approached by an elderly resident named George. "You're doing it wrong," the man said matter-of-factly. "You'll hurt your back that way." James straightened defensively. "I've got it under control." "No, you don't," George replied without malice. "Been watching you. You've never cleaned a thing in your life, have you?" The accuracy of the observation stung. James was about to make a cutting remark when George continued. "I was a maintenance supervisor for 30 years before the company went overseas. Had my own house, family, the whole bit." He demonstrated a more efficient scrubbing technique. "Then my wife got sick. No insurance. You know how it goes." James didn't know, had never considered how quickly privilege could evaporate. He found himself listening to George's story with growing discomfort, especially when George mentioned the shelter's reduced services. "Used to have a job training program," George explained. "Got cut a few years back, when some big donor pulled out. Shame. Helped a lot of folks get back on their feet." James felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, not quite guilt, but an uncomfortable awareness that his financial decisions had real-world consequences beyond spreadsheets. Olivia's intake duties exposed her to stories that would later emerge in her art, narratives of resilience and desperation told by people society had rendered invisible. On day 5, she interviewed a young woman with a 4-year-old daughter, who had fled domestic violence only to find herself without resources or family support. "We were middle class," the woman explained quietly, her daughter coloring beside her. I had a degree, a job. Then I married the wrong person, and everything unraveled. No one thinks it can happen to them. Olivia, who had deliberately distanced herself from family wealth while still having it as a safety net, felt the precariousness of her own independence in a new light. Thomas' overnight shifts gave him a unique perspective. In the quiet hours when most residents slept, he patrolled the darkened dormitory, witnessing moments of vulnerability impossible to see during daylight. A man whispering reassurances to himself. An elderly woman clutching a photo as she slept. A teenager silently crying. He also had time to observe the facility itself, the patched plumbing, the outdated electrical system, the security measures installed but never activated due to budget constraints. Having overseen Blackwood Foundation grants, he recognized the hallmarks of promised funding that had never materialized. By the 6th day, the siblings had stopped complaining about their assignments. The performative aspect of their service had given way to something more genuine, not quite transformation, but a crack in their armor of privilege. During their rare moments together, they spoke little, each processing their experiences privately. On the final morning, as they prepared to leave, Rita gathered them in her office. Her expression was unreadable. "Ms. Weber has informed me that your week of service is complete," she said. "Before you go, there's something you should see." She opened a file folder and placed 4 documents on her desk. 5 years ago, Horizon House was selected as a flagship project for the Blackwood Foundation. We were promised $3 million over 5 years to expand our facilities and services. She tapped the first document, a press release with James' quote about the Foundation's commitment to addressing homelessness. 2 years in, the funding was abruptly redirected. She placed the second document beside the first, a formal letter notifying Horizon House of the termination of their grant. The siblings exchanged confused glances. "I don't understand," Thomas said carefully. "What does this have to do with us?" Rita's eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything. Because you are Alexandra, James, Olivia, and Thomas Blackwood." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Their aliases had been compromised, or perhaps had never been effective in the first place. "Ms. Weber instructed me to reveal this only on your final day," Rita continued. "She also asked me to share these." The third document was an internal foundation memo, written by James, recommending the diversion of Horizon House funding to a more promising investment opportunity in cryptocurrency ventures. The fourth was a financial summary showing the subsequent loss of the diverted funds, $3 million, that had evaporated while generating substantial fees for James' investment firm. James' face drained of color. "That was a confidential foundation decision," he said weakly. "A decision that forced us to cut our job training program, reduce our medical services, and eliminate 20 staff positions," Rita replied evenly. "A decision that affected real people, like the ones you've been serving this week." Alexandra turned to James, her expression hardening. "You diverted shelter funding to one of your crypto ventures. The one that collapsed completely." "It was a calculated risk," James defended, though his voice lacked conviction. "The potential returns would have allowed us to fund 10 shelters. But it didn't generate returns, did it?" Thomas said quietly. "It generated fees for your firm, then collapsed." Olivia stared at her brother. "All those people we met, George, Maria and her daughter, the veterans in the East Wing, their services were cut because of you." James looked trapped. "The foundation board approved the recommendation. It wasn't just my decision." "You were the one who pushed for it," Thomas countered. "I remember the meeting. You said you'd personally vetted the shelter, and found it operationally deficient. Had you ever actually been here before this week?" Rita asked directly. James' silence was answer enough. Rita stood, gathering the documents. "Ms. Weber wanted you to understand the real-world impact of financial decisions made from boardrooms. Consider it lesson 1 of your inheritance journey." She left them alone in the office, the weight of the revelation settling around them like a shroud. "Mother knew," Alexandra said finally. "She designed this task specifically to expose this." "She designed it to expose me," James corrected bitterly. "To make me the villain." Thomas shook his head. "She designed it to show us the consequences of our actions. This is just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked. "Think about it," Thomas explained. "Mother arranged for us to spend a week at a shelter directly harmed by a Blackwood Foundation decision. That's not coincidence, it's calculated. If the first task is this precisely targeted, what does that suggest about the remaining 6? The siblings absorbed this in uneasy silence, each contemplating what secrets Eleanor might have planned to reveal about them. "We should go," Alexandra said finally. "Harriet will be waiting." As they collected their few belongings, The residents and staff they'd worked alongside for a week watched with new understanding. Their true identities had apparently been known all along, their presence a source of bitter irony for those affected by the Blackwood Foundation's broken promises. In the van back to Blackwood House, James sat alone, physically separated from his siblings. The revelation had accomplished exactly what Eleanor intended, fracturing their tentative solidarity and establishing a pattern of exposure that would govern the tasks to come. "This is what she wants," he said finally, breaking the silence. "To turn us against each other." "No," Thomas replied. "This is about accountability. She's making us face what we've become." Harriet was waiting on the front steps of Blackwood House when they arrived, her expression revealing nothing of what she knew or had orchestrated. "The service task is complete," she announced formally. "You have demonstrated your capacity for basic human labor and witnessed the impact of your family's decisions. The next task begins tomorrow." "Wait," Alexandra interjected. "We need time to process what just happened, to discuss." "Mrs. Blackwood allocated no recovery time between tasks," Harriet interrupted. "The heritage task begins at 9 a.m. tomorrow. You are to restore the family vacation home in Gloucester to its original condition. No contractors, no hired help, just the four of you." "The beach house?" Olivia asked, surprised. "It's been abandoned for years." "Precisely," Harriet replied. "Your instructions and supplies will be waiting for you there. Transportation leaves at 8 a.m. She turned to go, then paused, looking back at James with an unreadable expression. "Mrs. Blackwood believed that understanding requires experience. I trust you've gained some this week, Mr. James." He met her gaze defiantly, but found no judgment there, only the steady assessment of someone measuring progress against expectations. As Harriet drove away, the siblings stood on the steps of their family home, irrevocably changed by their week of service and the first of Eleanor's revelations. The facade of cooperation had cracked, exposing the fault lines Eleanor had known existed all along. The first task was complete. 6 more remained. In her car, Harriet made a brief notation in her book, "Service task complete." James exposed as anticipated. Family unity compromised as expected. Foundation laid for heritage task revelation. She closed the book and drove toward Cambridge, where she would prepare the documents that would expose Alexandra's betrayal of Olivia, the next revelation in Eleanor's carefully orchestrated redemption of the Blackwood family. The Blackwood summer house in Gloucester had been closed for almost a decade. Eleanor had abruptly stopped using it this summer after their father's death, claiming the sea air aggravated her allergies. Truth, which the siblings understood without discussing, was that the house contained too many memories of a time when they had functioned as an actual family. The van deposited them at the end of the long gravel driveway just before 9 a.m. The driver unloaded for duffel bags containing work clothes and basic toiletries, then departed without a word, leaving them staring at the dilapidated Victorian structure perched on the rocky coastline. "She can't be serious," Alexandra said, surveying the peeling paint, sagging porch, and overgrown garden. "This would take a professional crew weeks." Thomas picked up his bag and started walking. "We have 7 days. Let's not waste time complaining." The others followed reluctantly, still processing the revelation about James from the previous day. Alexandra and Olivia had maintained a frigid silence toward him since learning about his role in cutting the shelter's funding. Thomas, while clearly disappointed, had adopted a pragmatic approach. They needed to complete all 7 tasks together, regardless of personal grievances. The house smelled of mildew and neglect when they pushed open the front door. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through filthy windows. Furniture sat shrouded under yellowing sheets, ghostly shapes in the dim interior. A large envelope waited on the entry table, Harriet's precise handwriting addressing it to all for siblings. Thomas opened it and read aloud. "The heritage task requires complete restoration of the summer house to its condition as of August 2005, the last summer you spent here as a complete family. Particular attention must be paid to the gazebo, where the sibling pact was made. Supplies are in the garage and basement. Assessments will be conducted via the security system and through direct inspection upon completion. No outside assistance is permitted." Attached was a detailed inventory of what needed to be accomplished: structural repairs to the porch and gazebo, complete exterior painting, garden restoration, interior cleaning and repairs, and furniture refurbishment. August 2005. Olivia repeated softly. "The summer before Father died. Also the summer before you applied for that art scholarship," Alexandra said, not meeting Olivia's eyes. A strange tension suddenly filled the air between the sisters. James and Thomas exchanged confused glances. "Well," James said, clearly attempting to redirect the conversation, "we should divide the work logically. Thomas and I can handle the structural repairs. Alexandra and Olivia can tackle the interior." Defaulting to gendered assignments, Olivia challenged. "How progressive of you, Jamie." James flushed. "It's about efficiency. Alexandra doesn't know a hammer from a handsaw, and you actually built sets for 3 years at an experimental theater in Brooklyn," Olivia finished. "I'm quite handy with power tools." "Fine," Alexandra interjected. "Thomas and Olivia on structural repairs. James and I will handle the interior. Let's get started." They separated to survey their respective domains. The house was worse than it appeared from outside. Years of neglect had allowed water damage in several areas. The once immaculate gardens were a tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs. The gazebo, perched on the cliff overlooking the Atlantic, listed dangerously to one side, its once charming structure now a hazard. By midday, they had established work areas and begun the seemingly insurmountable task. Thomas and Olivia tackled the gazebo first, as it presented the greatest structural challenge. Alexandra started methodically cleaning the first floor, while James reluctantly began clearing debris from the gardens. They worked in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what this particular task might be designed to reveal. The revelation from Horizon House had put them all on edge, wondering what other buried secrets Eleanor had planned to expose. On the third day, as Thomas and Olivia were reinforcing the gazebo's foundation, Thomas broached the subject that had been hanging between the sisters. "What was that tension with Alexandra about the art scholarship?" he asked, carefully aligning a support beam. Olivia's rhythm with the hammer faltered briefly. "Nothing. Ancient history. Nothing doesn't create that kind of tension, after 15 years, Thomas persisted. "And Mother chose this specific summer to restore." "There's a reason," Olivia sighed, setting down her hammer. "The summer of 2005, I applied for the Whitfield Foundation Scholarship, a full ride to Rhode Island School of Design. It was my ticket out, away from Mother's expectations. I was a finalist, but then—" "You didn't get it," Thomas finished, recalling her disappointment that fall. "No, I didn't," Olivia confirmed. "The selection committee suddenly decided my portfolio showed technical promise but lacked emotional maturity. It was devastating, and Alexandra was involved somehow." Olivia shrugged, picking up her hammer again. "Like I said, ancient history." Inside the house, Alexandra was methodically cleaning their father's study when James entered with armfuls of garden waste for the fire they'd built to dispose of debris. "You're being thorough," he observed, watching her carefully dusting each book on the shelves. "Some of us take all our responsibilities seriously," she replied coldly. James winced. "Are we really going to do this for 7 days? I made a business decision that had unfortunate consequences." "I've acknowledged that. You made a selfish decision that hurt vulnerable people, then lied about it," Alexandra corrected. "But by all means, let's talk about responsibility and consequences." James studied her for a moment. "You know, for someone sitting on such a high horse, you seem awfully tense. Whenever Olivia mentions that art scholarship." Alexandra's dusting became more forceful. "That's irrelevant." "Is it? Mother specifically chose summer 2005 for this task. She's building to something." "Focus on your own revelations, James," Alexandra snapped. "God knows you've provided enough material." As night fell, they gathered in the kitchen for a simple meal, prepared from the surprisingly well-stocked pantry Harriet had arranged. The physical labor had exhausted them, making conversation minimal and guarded. Each was becoming increasingly aware that every room in this house held memories, and potentially, evidence of past transgressions. On the fourth day, while clearing out the attic, Thomas discovered a locked wooden box marked Eleanor Blackwood, personal. Using his pocket knife, he managed to jimmy the simple lock. Inside were bundles of letters, organized chronologically and bound with faded ribbons. Curiosity overcame his initial hesitation. He selected a bundle from 2005 and began to read. Most were business correspondence, foundation matters, and communications with the children's schools. Then he found a series of letters regarding Olivia's scholarship application. The final letter in the sequence froze his blood. It was from Alexandra to the Whitfield Foundation Selection Committee, written on Blackwood Foundation letterhead. In it, she raised concerns about Olivia Blackwood's stability and commitment, citing fictional incidents of emotional outbursts and plagiarism. The letter concluded by suggesting the committee consider more reliable candidates who would better represent the Foundation's values. Thomas sat back, stunned by the discovery. Alexandra had deliberately sabotaged Olivia's chance at independence, her opportunity to escape Eleanor's influence and pursue her passion. But why? He carefully returned the letters to the box, except for Alexandra's letter to the selection committee, which he slipped into his pocket. This was undoubtedly the revelation Eleanor had planned for the heritage task. The question was when and how to address it. Meanwhile, in the garden, James had uncovered a stone bench overgrown with ivy. As he cleared the vegetation, he noticed an inscription, "Richard Blackwood, beloved husband and father, the anchor of our family." It was dated the year after their father's death. James traced the letters with his finger, remembering the man who had tempered Eleanor's ambition with kindness, who had made time for each child despite his demanding schedule. With their father's death, something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic. Eleanor's innate coldness, previously balanced by Richard's warmth, had become the dominant force in their lives. On the fifth day, as Alexandra was cleaning out her old bedroom, she found her teenage diary wedged behind the headboard. Reading it brought back a flood of memories, her jealousy of Olivia's artistic talent, her desperate need for Eleanor's approval, and her fear that Olivia would escape while she remained trapped in the role of the perfect daughter. The diary entry from July 28, 2005, made her stomach clench. Mother compared my Harvard acceptance letter to Olivia's scribbles today, asking why I couldn't have received the artistic talent, in addition to the academic ability, as if I haven't tried everything to please her. Nothing is ever enough. And now Olivia might get that scholarship and Mother will have to acknowledge her. Worthless art has value. I can't let that happen. The next entry detailed her plan to write to the selection committee. Reading it now, 15 years later, Alexandra felt a wave of shame so intense it left her breathless. She had been 19, desperate for Eleanor's approval, willing to destroy her sister's dreams to preserve her own position as the successful daughter. She closed the diary and sat on the edge of the bed, wondering if Eleanor had known about this betrayal all along, if this task was specifically designed to force her to confront what she had done. On the sixth day, Thomas finally decided to act. He found Olivia alone in the gazebo, which they had successfully restored to its former charm. She was repainting the intricate lattice work, her artistic precision evident in every brushstroke. "I found something in the attic," he said without preamble, holding out Alexandra's letter. "I think you should read it." Olivia took the letter, confusion turning to shock as she absorbed its contents. Her hands trembled slightly. "Alexandra did this," she whispered. "She's the reason I didn't get the scholarship." Thomas nodded grimly. "It appears so." Olivia stood abruptly, the letter crushed in her fist. "Do you know what that scholarship meant to me? It was my only chance to develop my art without Mother's constant criticism, without having to beg for money or approval." "I know," Thomas said softly. "All these years," Olivia continued, her voice rising, "I've blamed myself. Thought I wasn't good enough. And it was Alexandra, my own sister." She stormed toward the house, Thomas following anxiously behind. They found Alexandra and James in the kitchen, preparing lunch. "How could you?" Olivia demanded, throwing the crumpled letter onto the counter. "How could you do this to me?" Alexandra's face drained of color as she recognized the letter. "Where did you get that?" "Mother kept it," Thomas explained, along with all her other correspondence, almost as if she knew it would be needed someday. James picked up the letter, reading it with growing disbelief. "Jesus, Alex, this is cold, even for you." Alexandra's eyes filled with tears, a sight so unexpected that it momentarily silenced the others. "I was 19 and desperately trying to remain Mother's favorite," she said quietly. "You were about to escape, Olivia, to become the artist everyone knew you could be, and I would be left alone with her impossible expectations. So you destroyed my chance." Olivia's voice cracked with emotion. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? The years of self-doubt, the struggle to believe in my work." "I found my diary," Alexandra admitted. "I've spent today reading the thoughts of a jealous, insecure girl willing to hurt her sister to protect her own position. I barely recognize that person now." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs outside. Decades of rivalry and resentment, carefully nurtured by Eleanor's manipulative parenting, hung in the air between them. "The sibling pact," Thomas said suddenly. "That's why Mother specifically mentioned the gazebo in her instructions." The others looked at him in confusion. "Don't you remember? Summer 2005, in the gazebo. We made a pact to always protect each other, to be unified against Mother's manipulation." "Alexandra, you were heading to law school. James, you were starting at the company. Olivia, you were applying for the scholarship. I was starting at boarding school. We promised to support each other's paths." Recognition dawned on their faces. The sibling pact had been their childish attempt to preserve their bond despite Eleanor's constant efforts to pit them against each other. It had failed almost immediately, as evidenced by Alexandra's betrayal of Olivia just months later. Mother knew, James said slowly. She knew about the letter, about the pact, about all of it. She's making us confront how we failed each other. Alexandra turned to Olivia, naked remorse in her expression. I can't undo what I did. But I am so deeply sorry, Liv. I've carried this guilt for 15 years without even acknowledging it to myself. Olivia's anger hadn't dissipated, but something else entered her expression, a complexity of emotion that reflected their shared history and the manipulative environment that had shaped them. I need time, she said finally. This isn't something I can just forgive over lunch. The revelation cast a pall over their final day of restoration. They continued working, completing the tasks as required, but the easy camaraderie they had developed over the week had evaporated. Olivia worked alone, processing her feelings about Alexandra's betrayal. Alexandra threw herself into work with a desperate energy, as if physical labor could atone for past sins. James and Thomas exchanged worried glances, wondering how this new fracture would affect their ability to complete the remaining tasks. By sunset on the 7th day, the house had been transformed. Fresh paint gleamed in the late afternoon light. Gardens were neatly trimmed. The gazebo stood strong against the coastal winds, and the interior sparkled with polished wood and clean surfaces. They had successfully restored the physical structure to its 2005 condition, but the emotional restoration of their relationship seemed a far more daunting task. As they gathered their belongings, preparing for Harriet's inspection the following morning, Thomas found Olivia sitting alone in the gazebo. I've been thinking about the revelations so far, he said, joining her on the bench. James' diversion of shelter funds, Alexandra's sabotage of your scholarship. There's a pattern emerging. Olivia looked at him questioningly. Mother is exposing how we've betrayed each other, how we failed to live up to the value she claimed to instill in us, Thomas continued, which makes me wonder what she has planned for each of us still to come. You think we're all going to be exposed in turn? Olivia asked. Thomas nodded grimly. I'm certain of it. She wouldn't single out James and Alexandra while leaving us untouched. Whatever sins we've committed against each other, she knows about them. And she's going to force us to face them, one task at a time. What could you possibly have done? Olivia asked, genuinely curious. You've always been the peacemaker, the loyal one. Thomas stared out at the darkening ocean. Everyone has secrets, Liv. Even me. The next morning, Harriet arrived promptly at 9 a.m. She walked through the house methodically, checking off items on her clipboard without comment. The siblings waited tensely in the living room, the restored furniture a cruel reminder of happier times. Finally, Harriet joined them. The heritage task is complete, she announced. You have successfully restored the physical structure and grounds to their 2005 condition. Her gaze lingered on Alexandra and Olivia. I trust you've also uncovered what was hidden here. We found Alexandra's letter, Thomas confirmed. Was that what Mother intended us to discover? Mrs. Blackwood believed that healing requires acknowledgement of past wrongs, Harriet replied. This task was designed to reveal how early the sibling bond was broken, and by whom. She turned to Alexandra. The question now is whether acknowledgement can lead to forgiveness. Alexandra met her gaze steadily, though her eyes were red from a night of silent tears. That's not up to you or Mother to decide. It's between Olivia and me. For the first time, something like approval flickered in Harriet's expression. Indeed, Ms. Alexandra, the relationships you rebuild, or don't, are your own choice. Mrs. Blackwood merely provided the opportunity for truth. She consulted her clipboard. The business ethics task begins tomorrow. You will conduct a complete audit of Blackwood Maritime Services, the shipping subsidiary that has been losing money for 3 consecutive years. You are to identify the source of the losses and present a viable turnaround strategy. She handed Thomas a thick folder. The necessary documentation is here. You have 5 days. As Harriet prepared to leave, Olivia suddenly spoke. Why is she doing this? What does she hope to accomplish by dredging up all our worst moments? Harriet paused at the door. Mrs. Blackwood believed that a fortune built on deception and rivalry would ultimately destroy itself. The tasks are her attempt to determine whether you can become worthy of the Blackwood legacy, not just as individuals, but as a family. With that enigmatic statement, she departed, leaving the siblings to contemplate the next challenge, and wonder whose secrets would be exposed next. In the van back to Boston, they sat in uncomfortable silence. The restored summer house behind them stood as a monument to both their collaborative achievement and their fractured relationships. 2 tasks completed, 5 to go. The heritage task had forced them to confront how rivals had replaced siblings, how ambition had corrupted love. Somewhere in her meticulous notebooks, Harriet had already documented this outcome, preparing for the next revelation in Eleanor's grand design. The business ethics task would expose yet another betrayal, this one involving Thomas, whose facade of loyalty concealed financial manipulations that had kept the family business artificially prosperous at Eleanor's direction. The home ruler continued her rule, measuring the Blackwood children against Eleanor's exacting standards, documenting their progress toward an outcome only Eleanor fully understood. The Blackwood Maritime Services headquarters occupied 3 floors of a sleek office building in Boston's financial district. Unlike the aging glamour of Blackwood House, or the neglected charm of the summer residence, BMS projected contemporary corporate efficiency, all glass, steel, and calculated intimidation. As the siblings entered the executive conference room on the 32nd floor, Thomas felt a strange disconnection. He had attended countless meetings in this very room, presenting quarterly reports to Eleanor and the board, navigating the complex politics of a family business. Now he entered as part of a forced audit team, suspicious of the company he had helped build. "This feels wrong," he murmured to Alexandra as they arranged their materials on the gleaming table. "I've been running this division with Mother for 5 years. Which means you should have caught whatever problems exist," she replied pragmatically, already scanning the financial documents Harriet had provided. 3 consecutive years of losses don't happen accidentally. James set up his laptop, his financial analyst instincts kicking in despite his lingering status as family pariah. The shipping industry has been volatile since the Asian market contraction. Many companies are struggling, but not like this, Alexandra countered, pointing to a spreadsheet. "These aren't market-driven losses. There's a pattern here, predictable quarterly dips followed by partial recoveries that never quite reach previous levels." Olivia, who had maintained a careful distance from Alexandra since the revelation at the summer house, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. "I don't understand why Mother included me in this task. I know nothing about shipping or finance." "Fresh eyes," Thomas suggested. "You might see patterns the rest of us miss because we're too close to it. Or she wanted all of us to witness whatever revelation is coming," James added darkly. The door opened, and Harriet entered with Stephen Davis, BMS's chief financial officer. Stephen was a nervous man in his 50s who had served the Blackwood family for over 20 years, his loyalty purchased with generous compensation, and the occasional blind eye to questionable practices. "Mr. Davis will provide whatever records you require," Harriet announced. "The audit must be conducted here, with no documents leaving the building. You have 5 days to complete your assessment and present a turnaround strategy." She placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This contains specific areas that Mrs. Blackwood wished you to examine." After Harriet departed, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Stephen shifted his weight anxiously, aware that something unusual was happening but clearly uninformed about the details. Thomas opened the envelope and read aloud. "The audit must include comprehensive review of international shipping routes established in the last 5 years, with particular attention to invoice series AEC 7500 through AEC 8900, and all transactions with Meridian Holdings and its subsidiaries." He looked up, puzzled. "Meridian Holdings? I've never heard of them." Stephen cleared his throat. "It's a Singapore-based investment group. We've had limited dealings with them." Alexandra was already typing the name into a database search. "Limited dealings. There are over 30 transactions here, totaling nearly $12 million. Stephen's discomfort visibly increased. "Mrs. Blackwood handled those arrangements personally, with Mr. Thomas' assistance." All eyes turned to Thomas, who looked genuinely confused. "I've never worked with any Meridian Holdings." "Perhaps not directly," Stephen suggested cautiously. "But you signed the authorizations. Your signature is on all the transfer documents." Thomas felt the first stirrings of unease. "Show me." The next several hours revealed a troubling pattern. Beginning 3 years earlier, large sums had been transferred to Meridian Holdings for consultation services and route optimization. The transfers corresponded precisely with BMS's decline in profitability. "This looks like systematic fund extraction," Alexandra said, her legal training taking over. "Money being deliberately moved out of the company through a shell corporation." "That's impossible," Thomas protested. "I would never authorize that." James had been unusually quiet, methodically checking figures against historical data. Now he looked up, his expression grim. "The signatures are yours, Thomas." "Every single one." "Let me see those," Thomas demanded, examining the documents closely. "These look like my signature, but I never signed these. Someone must have forged them." Olivia had been sorting physical records into chronological order. "These dates are interesting," she observed. "The first transfer happened the week after Mother's health scare 3 years ago, when she was briefly hospitalized for exhaustion." Thomas remembered the incident vividly. Eleanor had collapsed during a board meeting, leading to a week-long hospital stay and reluctant promises to reduce her workload. Shortly afterward, she had given Thomas increased operational control of BMS while maintaining final approval authority. "Stephen," he said carefully, "who else had signing authority during this period?" The CFO looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Only Mrs. Blackwood and yourself." The implication hung in the air, impossible to ignore but difficult to voice. "Alexandra did it for him." "Are you suggesting Mother systematically drained funds from her own company?" "Why would she do that?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I didn't sign these documents." They worked late into the night, establishing a timeline of suspicious transactions. The pattern became clear with each document they examined. BMS had been deliberately undermined from within, its profitability sacrificed to fund Meridian Holdings, an entity that appeared to exist solely on paper. On the second day, they expanded their investigation to include all subsidiaries of Meridian Holdings. The corporate structure was a labyrinth of offshore entities and holding companies, clearly designed to obscure ownership and financial flows. "This is sophisticated financial engineering," James remarked, a hint of reluctant admiration in his voice. "Whoever designed this knew exactly how to hide money." By midday, they had traced the funds through 3 intermediate companies to a private investment account in the Cayman Islands. The account holder's name was redacted in the documents, but the timing of withdrawals corresponded perfectly with Eleanor's international travel schedule. She was moving company funds to private accounts, Alexandra concluded, the evidence now undeniable. "But why risk the company's stability? The Blackwood fortune is already substantial. And why implicate Thomas?" Olivia added, studying her younger brother with renewed interest. "These forged signatures put him at legal risk." Thomas had grown increasingly withdrawn as the evidence mounted. Now he stared at the documents spread across the table, trying to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the systematic deception revealed by their audit. "Maybe she needed money that couldn't be traced," James suggested. "Something she couldn't access through normal channels without raising questions." "Like what?" Olivia challenged. James shrugged. "Political contributions, a secret venture, blackmail payments. Who knows what secrets Mother kept?" On the third day, they discovered the connection that changed everything. Among the electronic records, Alexandra found emails between Eleanor and Stephen regarding the Thomas Protocol, a procedure for processing transactions that required Thomas' signature. The emails explicitly detailed how Stephen was to present routine documents for Thomas' signature, then substitute the Meridian authorization forms in the executed paperwork. Eleanor's instructions were precise and left no room for misinterpretation. Thomas was to remain unaware of the transactions while providing the necessary authorization. When confronted with the emails, Stephen broke down. "Mrs. Blackwood assured me it was for the long-term security of the company," he explained miserably. "She said Mr. Thomas couldn't know because of potential legal exposure, but that everything was being documented for eventual reconciliation." "You helped her frame me," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "All these years, I thought I was helping run the company, and you were using me as a legal shield." "Not just you," Alexandra interjected, having continued her search through the records. "All of us." She displayed a series of Foundation board minutes showing that James' recommendation to divert the Horizon House funding had been preceded by unusual pressure from Eleanor. Similar documentation showed Eleanor's quiet intervention with the Whitfield Foundation, before Alexandra's letter sabotaging Olivia's scholarship. "She orchestrated all of it," Alexandra said quietly. "She created situations where we would make terrible choices, then documented everything for future use." For these tasks, Olivia realized, she was building her case against us for years. The siblings fell silent, absorbing the magnitude of Eleanor's manipulation. She hadn't just designed 7 tasks to test them, she had spent years engineering the failures they would be forced to confront. On the 4th day, they finally uncovered the purpose of the diverted funds. Meridian Holdings had used the money to acquire controlling interests in the very companies that competed with Blackwood subsidiaries. The strategy was brilliantly simple: weaken BMS while strengthening its competitors, then use the competitors to apply pressure on the larger Blackwood enterprises. She was creating leverage against her own company, James said. "Amaze. But why?" The answer came on the final day of their audit. Deep in the electronic archives, they discovered a secure folder labeled Contingency. It contained detailed plans for the restructuring of all Blackwood enterprises, to be implemented only under specific conditions, outlined in a document titled Succession Protocol. The protocol specified that in the event of Eleanor's death, control of the Blackwood fortune would transfer not according to her public will, but through a complex series of transactions that would consolidate power in a trust controlled by unnamed executors. The protocol could only be superseded if her children met certain character and competence requirements that appeared to align perfectly with the 7 tasks they were now undertaking. She created a fail-safe, Thomas said, understanding dawning. If we failed her tests, the money would never actually come to us, regardless of what the public will stated. And she used Thomas as the unwitting accomplice, Alexandra added. If the plan ever came to light, he would appear responsible. Thomas sat back, stunned by the revelation. I trusted her completely. I structured my entire life around making her proud, being her reliable son. And all along, she was setting me up to take the fall if necessary. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, the first genuine gesture of solidarity any of them had shown since the Heritage Task revelation. We were all manipulated, Thomas, each in our own way. On the morning of the presentation, Harriet arrived with Franklin Moss. The siblings had prepared a comprehensive report detailing the financial engineering they had uncovered and a turnaround strategy that would gradually reintegrate the diverted funds without destabilizing either BMS or its competitors. Thomas delivered the presentation, his voice steady despite the betrayal he had discovered. He outlined Eleanor's systematic weakening of BMS, the fraudulent use of his signature, and the creation of shadow competitors using company funds. The turnaround strategy must begin with leadership transparency, he concluded. No company can succeed when its own executives are working against its interests. Harriet's expression remained impassive throughout the presentation. When Thomas finished, she nodded once. The business ethics task is complete. You have identified the source of the company's decline and proposed a viable recovery strategy. That's it, Alexandra demanded. No acknowledgement of what Mother did. No explanation for why she deliberately implicated Thomas in financial fraud. Mrs. Blackwood's motivations are not relevant to the completion of the task, Harriet replied evenly. You were asked to conduct an audit and develop a strategy. You have done so successfully. It's entirely relevant, James countered, surprising everyone with his vehemence. She systematically manipulated all of us, created situations where we would make damaging choices, then documented everything to use against us in these tasks. How can we trust anything about this process? Harriet considered this challenge carefully. The tasks are designed to reveal truth, Mr. James. Sometimes that truth is about Mrs. Blackwood herself. What you choose to do with these revelations is your decision. Franklin Moss, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. If I may add, these discoveries could have legal implications for the Blackwood estate and for Thomas personally. As your family attorney, I advise caution in how you proceed. Meaning what? Thomas asked sharply. That I should continue to accept responsibility for transactions I never authorized. That we should all pretend Mother wasn't, systematically undermining her own company, meaning that family matters are often more complex than they appear, Franklin replied diplomatically. Mrs. Blackwood may have had reasons beyond what is immediately evident, or she may have been cruel and manipulative, Olivia suggested, capable of sacrificing her own son's reputation to maintain control even after death. Harriet gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. The personal sacrifice task begins tomorrow. You will each be required to surrender something of significant personal value, as determined by Mrs. Blackwood before her death. She handed them each a sealed envelope. These contain your individual requirements. The task will commence at 9 a.m. at Blackwood House. As Harriet and Franklin departed, the siblings were left with the uncomfortable truth of their mother's deception and their own complicity in a system built on manipulation and control. We need to talk about this, Alexandra said, once they were alone. About all of it. Mother's manipulation, these tasks, what it means for us going forward. Thomas stared at the sealed envelope in his hand, wondering what Eleanor had decided he should sacrifice next. He had already lost his illusions about his role in the company, and his relationship with his mother. What more could she take? There's something else we should discuss, James said quietly. The succession protocol mentioned executors, plural. Harriet can't be doing this alone. Someone else is involved in administering these tasks. Franklin, Olivia suggested. Possibly, Alexandra conceded. but he seemed genuinely concerned about the legal implications. I'm not sure he's fully in the loop. There's another possibility, Thomas said slowly. What if Mother had a partner in all this? Someone who helped design the tasks, who knows what revelations are coming next? The question hung in the air, adding another layer of uncertainty to their already precarious situation. 7 tasks, for siblings, 3 revelations already made. Each task stripped away another layer of deception, revealing not only their own failings, but the elaborate architecture of Eleanor's control. As they left BMS headquarters for the last time, Thomas glanced back at the building where he had spent 5 years believing he was earning his mother's trust and respect. Now he understood that trust had never been part of Eleanor's vocabulary, only control, manipulation, and contingency planning. The business ethics task had revealed a truth more painful than any of them had anticipated. Their mother had been willing to sacrifice her own son's reputation to maintain her grip on the family fortune. The revelation left them wondering what additional cruelties awaited in the remaining 4 tasks, and whether they would emerge from Eleanor's final test as a family at all. The sealed envelope sat before each sibling at the breakfast table in Blackwood House, none of them eager to discover what Eleanor had determined they should sacrifice. After the revelations of the business ethics task, the systematic way Eleanor had manipulated and documented their worst choices, they approached this new challenge with growing wariness. Should we open them together? Thomas suggested, eyeing his envelope as though it might contain something venomous. Might as well, Alexandra replied, her usual decisiveness dulled by fatigue. The successive revelations had taken their toll on all of them. They opened the envelope simultaneously, each pulling out a single card bearing Harriet's precise handwriting. The silence that followed was profound. Alexandra's face drained of color, as she read her card again, as if hoping the words might somehow change. James swore under his breath, while Olivia closed her eyes briefly, her fingers tightening around the card. Thomas simply stared at his instruction, his expression unreadable. She can't be serious. Alexandra finally broke the silence. What's yours? James asked, his voice strained. Alexandra hesitated, then read aloud. Alexandra Blackwood must surrender her law license for a period of 1 year, effective immediately. Documentation of voluntary suspension citing personal reasons must be submitted to the relevant bar associations by 5 p.m. today. She's attacking our identities, James said grimly. He turned his card so the others could see. James Blackwood must publicly disclose the full details of the Horizon House funding diversion and his role in the shelter's subsequent service reductions. The disclosure must be made via press release to major financial publications, and a personal appearance at Horizon House to apologize to staff and residents. Olivia read hers next, her voice barely audible. Olivia Blackwood must surrender her art studio and all works in progress. The space and contents will be locked and inaccessible for 1 year. All scheduled exhibitions and commissions must be cancelled. They turned to Thomas, who hadn't yet spoken. He placed his card on the table where they could all read it. Thomas Blackwood must resign his position as Executive Vice President of Blackwood Enterprises, effective immediately. The resignation must cite ethical concerns about company practices and be submitted to the board and senior management. She's stripping us of the things that define us, Olivia observed, a tremor in her voice. My art, Alexandra's legal career, James' reputation, Thomas' position in the company, the position I was apparently only holding to take the fall of her financial manipulations, were discovered, Thomas added bitterly. The door opened and Harriet entered, her timing as precise as ever. I see you've received your instructions for the personal sacrifice task. This goes beyond reasonable, Alexandra protested. Surrendering my law license would devastate my career. Clients would leave, the partnership track would be compromised. All of these requirements would cause significant personal hardship, Harriet acknowledged. That is precisely the point of sacrifice. My resignation would implicate me in Mother's financial schemes, Thomas argued. I'd be admitting to wrongdoing I didn't commit. The requirement is to cite ethical concerns, not to admit personal wrongdoing, Harriet clarified. The interpretation of that statement is left to others. And what happens if we refuse? James challenged. As with all tasks, failure by any one of you means failure for all, Harriet reminded them. The entire inheritance would be distributed according to the alternate will. Alexandra's legal mind was already seeking loopholes. The Bar Association would require specific grounds for suspension. Personal reasons is insufficient. Mrs. Blackwood anticipated this concern, Harriet replied, producing a folder. These documents provide the necessary language and procedures for each jurisdiction where you hold licenses. They have been reviewed by Mr. Moss for compliance. Of course they have, Alexandra muttered. Olivia had been examining her card repeatedly. My studio is under lease for another 8 months. I can't just abandon it. The lease will continue to be paid from Mrs. Blackwood's estate, Harriet explained. The space will simply be inaccessible to you and my current commissions. People are depending on those works. All clients will be notified of force majeure circumstances and deposits returned, Harriet said. The financial implications have been accounted for. The clinical precision with which Eleanor had planned their sacrifices made them all the more devastating. She had foreseen every objection, prepared for every contingency, designed each sacrifice to cut to the core of their identities. We need to discuss this privately, Thomas said finally. Harriet nodded. You have until 5 p.m. today to submit documentation of your sacrifices. I will return then to verify compliance. She placed a business card on the table. This contains contact information for the executor, who will handle the practical aspects of securing Ms. Olivia's studio. After she departed, the siblings sat in stunned silence, contemplating the magnitude of what Eleanor was demanding. $20 million, James said eventually. Is it worth this? That's not the only calculation, Thomas pointed out. If we refuse, we get nothing except the stipend, and we'll never know what the remaining tasks would have revealed. Knowledge has value too, Alexandra admitted reluctantly. Each task has exposed something significant. About Mother, about ourselves, about what she did to us, Olivia added. The way she engineered situations, where we would hurt each other, then documented everything for these tasks. They dispersed to consider their options privately. The personal sacrifice task was different from the previous challenges. The service task had required mere discomfort, the heritage task emotional confrontation, the business ethics task investigative skill. This task demanded concrete, measurable surrender of something each valued deeply. Alexandra retreated to the library, pulling up her law firm's partnership agreement on her laptop. A 1-year suspension would reset her partnership track completely. 5 years of ADR weeks, missed events for her daughter, sacrificed vacations, and strategic case selections, all undone by this voluntary suspension. Yet the alternative was walking away from $20 million and the remaining revelations Eleanor had planned. James sat in the garden, drafting and deleting versions of the required press release on his phone. Each iteration felt more career-ending than the last. He had built his reputation on calculated risk-taking and investor confidence. A public admission of fund misappropriation, even presented as an ethical awakening, would destroy that reputation overnight. His clients would flee. His investments would collapse under increased scrutiny. Olivia wandered through the house, finding herself eventually in Eleanor's study. The walls were lined with photographs of Blackwood achievements, buildings inaugurated, politicians influenced, charitable galas attended. Not a single image captured a moment of genuine family connection. Olivia's artwork was conspicuously absent, despite international gallery showings and critical acclaim. Her studio represented more than workspace. It was the only environment where she felt truly herself, free from Eleanor's pervasive judgment. Thomas went to his childhood bedroom, now maintained as an impersonal guest room with no trace of the boy who had once lived there. The posters, sports trophies, and academic awards had been removed years ago, replaced by bland hotel-like decor. It was a fitting metaphor for his position at Blackwood Enterprises, apparently significant but ultimately disposable. His resignation, citing ethical concerns, would end any chance of corporate leadership elsewhere. Eleanor had ensured that his sacrifice would be total. By mid-afternoon, they reconvened in the kitchen, drawn together by the weight of their individual decisions. I'm going to do it, Alexandra announced without preamble. I'm going to surrender my license. The others looked at her in surprise. Alexandra had always been the most career-driven among them. The partnership track can be rebuilt, she continued, her voice steady. But this, understanding, what Mother did, what we did to each other, what we might still learn, that's a different kind of value. That, and even more, connection with my daughter. That's been weighing on my mind too. I don't want her to think of me as we've thought of our mother. I'm in too, James said after a moment. The press release will be devastating, but I've rebuilt before. And frankly, after what we learned at Horizon House, maybe there's some justice in it. Olivia nodded slowly. I'll surrender my studio. The work inside represents months of effort, but, she hesitated, But maybe I've been hiding there rather than confronting what Alexandra's revelation did to my confidence as an artist. A year without that space might force growth in other ways. They turned to Thomas, who had been silent throughout the exchange. Thomas, Alexandra prompted gently. My resignation isn't just about losing a job, he said finally. It's about publicly accepting responsibility for Mother's financial manipulations, the very ones she designed to implicate me. She's forcing me to become the fall guy she groomed me to be. You could frame it differently, James suggested. Make it about taking a moral stand against practices you've discovered, without accepting culpability. Thomas considered this. Perhaps. But everyone will assume I was involved, especially after the audit findings start circulating internally. He sighed deeply. But yes, I'll do it. Not for the money, but because I need to know what else she planned. What other revelations are waiting? The decision made, they spent the remaining hours preparing their sacrifices. Alexandra drafted suspension requests for the 3 bar associations, where she held licenses. James composed a press release that walked the fine line between accepting responsibility and career suicide. Olivia made arrangements for her assistants to collect personal items from her studio before it was locked. Thomas wrote a resignation letter that carefully cited ethical concerns while avoiding self-incrimination. Harriet returned precisely at 5 p.m., accompanied by Franklin Moss, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. Have you completed the required sacrifices? Harriet inquired, her tone businesslike. They presented their documentation one by one. Alexandra's bar suspension requests, James' press release and confirmation of his scheduled appearance at Horizon House, Olivia's studio keys and signed acknowledgement of the terms, Thomas' resignation letter addressed to the Blackwood Enterprises board. Franklin reviewed each document carefully, making occasional notes. These appear to be in order, he confirmed finally. I'll process them immediately. The personal sacrifice task is now in progress, Harriet announced. Final verification will occur over the coming days as your sacrifices become effective. Alexandra's bar suspension must be confirmed by all relevant jurisdictions. JM's press release must be published and his apology delivered. Olivia's studio must be secured and all exhibitions cancelled. Thomas' resignation must be accepted by the board. And how long will this verification take? Alexandra asked. Approximately 1 week, during which time you will prepare for the reconciliation task. Another task, James protested. We're still in the middle of this one. The tasks are designed to overlap and compound, Harriet explained. Mrs. Blackwood believed that true character emerges when challenges multiply rather than arriving conveniently in sequence. She distributed another set of envelopes. These contain the names of individuals you have wronged throughout your lives. For the reconciliation task, you must locate these people and make genuine amends for the harm you caused them. The task begins immediately and runs concurrently with the verification period for your personal sacrifices. As Franklin and Harriet prepared to leave, Thomas posed the question that had been troubling him since the business ethics revelation. Harriet, did you know about Mother using my signature, setting me up to take the fall if her financial manipulations were discovered? Something flickered briefly in Harriet's eyes, discomfort, perhaps, or conflict. I was aware of Mrs. Blackwood's business strategies. That's not an answer, Thomas pressed. It is the only answer I can provide at this time, Mr. Thomas. Her formal tone created distance between them. The tasks will reveal what they are designed to reveal, in the sequence Mrs. Blackwood determined. After they departed, the siblings opened their new envelopes with weary resignation. The emotional toll of surrendering their professional identities had left them drained. Yet Eleanor's machinations continued without pause. Each envelope contained a name, an address, and a brief description of the harm done. Alexandra was to make amends to a junior associate she had discredited to secure a partnership promotion. James needed to reconcile with an early investor he had misled about fund performance. Olivia's assignment was a former collaborator, whose artistic contribution she had minimized in exhibition materials. Thomas stared at his assignment in disbelief. Harriet Weber, he read aloud, subjected to false accusations of financial impropriety to protect Blackwood family interests. He looked up at his siblings in confusion. I never accused Harriet of anything. Maybe not directly, Alexandra suggested, but collectively, as a family. They compared their assignments, looking for patterns. 3 involved professional relationships, individuals, whose careers or reputations they had damaged for personal gain. But Thomas' assignment was different. It implicated all of them in some harm done to Harriet herself. There's something Mother isn't telling us about Harriet, James observed. Her role goes beyond executor. She's part of the story somehow. As they contemplated this new dimension to the tasks, their phones began signaling the real-world impact of their sacrifices. Alexandra received confirmation of her bar suspension processing. James' publicist called in panic about the press release he had submitted. Olivia's gallery representative left increasingly concerned voicemails about her cancelled exhibitions. Thomas' executive assistant forwarded a stunned response from the board chair about his resignation. The personal sacrifice task was now irreversibly in motion, their professional identities suspended or destroyed as Eleanor had designed. They had surrendered the external markers of success that had defined them, leaving only the core question that seemed to underlie all of Eleanor's machinations: who were they without the trappings of the Blackwood name and fortune? What remained when status, power, and professional identity were stripped away? The answer would emerge in the crucible of the overlapping tasks, personal sacrifice blending into reconciliation, each revelation building upon the last until Eleanor's ultimate purpose became clear. That night, alone in their childhood bedrooms, each sibling confronted the magnitude of what they had surrendered, and what might still be required. The inheritance that had once seemed a straightforward transfer of wealth now appeared as Eleanor's final and most elaborate manipulation, a posthumous restructuring of their identities, relationships, and understanding of their shared past. For tasks completed or in progress, 3 remaining, the Blackwood siblings were being systematically dismantled and potentially rebuilt according to Eleanor's exacting specifications. The question none of them dared ask aloud was, what would remain of them when Eleanor's design was complete? Please see Part 2 for the conclusion of A Conditional Bequest, Sibling Rivalry and a Mother's Revenge.